Pilot demands black man switch seats. He fires back with a live call to the Aviation Authority. Marcus Carter never imagined his morning would spiral into a high-stakes standoff with an airline pilot at John F. Kennedy International Airport. He had boarded flight 2138, expecting little more than a cramped seat, a few hours of mild turbulence, and the typical rush to fetch overhead luggage once they touched down. But just moments before takeoff, a sudden demand shattered the pre-flight calm. "Sir, you need to switch seats. Now." That cold voice and the glint of confrontation in the pilot's eyes triggered a chain of events that would leave the entire cabin breathless. Little did anyone know that by the end of this journey, both dignity and destiny would be on the line. Marcus Carter woke up long before dawn, broke over Brooklyn. His humble apartment near Prospect Park was filled with a subdued glow from a single lamp he had left burning overnight. Outside, the sky was a washed-out grey, still deciding whether it wanted to give way to the day. Marcus had hardly slept, restless with anticipation for his flight to Los Angeles, a business trip that could change the course of his career. This was no ordinary conference he was heading to. As a junior marketing executive for a rising tech startup, Marcus had been chosen to deliver a cutting-edge pitch in a collaboration effort with a major client based on the West Coast. It was a dream opportunity, a chance to prove himself and secure his future. Although he could have used more sleep, adrenaline surged through his veins, fueling his determination to do everything perfectly. The day before, he had meticulously planned every minute detail packing, rechecking his portfolio, practicing his pitch for hours in front of the mirror. Growing up, Marcus had been taught that as a black man, he would need to be twice as good, twice as prepared, and carry himself with twice the confidence just to level the playing field. It was a lesson he'd learned over and over, whether in academic settings or corporate boardrooms. By the time Marcus hauled his suitcase down 4 flights of stairs and flagged a taxi to JFK, the sky had lightened to a pale peach color. He felt calm. The thought of flying never bothered him, in fact. He enjoyed the perspective one gained from tens of thousands of feet in the air. He always looked at plane rides as a momentary disconnection from the frenetic pace of life. No phone calls, no immediate deadlines. Just a vantage point high above. He had no inkling that this flight would become anything but peaceful. At John F. Kennedy International Airport, the usual swirl of activity surrounded him, travelers lugging suitcases, families wiping tears as they said goodbye, and business people like himself rushing to gates with determined expressions. Marcus breathed in the atmosphere, finding it strangely comforting in its routine chaos. The check-in process went smoothly. The gate agent, a polite older woman named Denise, smiled as she handed him his boarding pass. "Have a good trip, Mr. Carter," she said, noting his seat number was 12A, an aisle seat in the main cabin. Marcus was grateful for that. He preferred the aisle, especially for long flights, so he could stretch his legs and not feel boxed in. Once past security, Marcus found himself with an hour to spare. He briefly considered hitting one of the overpriced cafes to grab a coffee, but the line was already trailing halfway across the concourse. Instead, he decided to stroll around near his gate, Gate 19, listening to music through his headphones. He scrolled through his phone, double-checking emails, when an incoming message from his boss read, "All the best. Make us proud, Marcus." A sense of pride and responsibility swelled in him. He hadn't planned to let anyone down. If everything went well in Los Angeles, the next steps could mean a promotion, maybe even an office with a view. Marcus took a moment to look around and soak in the environment. There was a man wearing a pilot's uniform standing at a nearby desk, engaged in conversation with a couple of flight attendants. Something about his tone seemed clipped, almost annoyed, but Marcus shrugged it off as typical pre-flight stress. When the boarding call was finally announced for flight 2138 to Los Angeles, Marcus lined up behind a mix of passengers. As he edged closer to the gate, he noticed the pilot again, tall, broad-shouldered, his expression stern behind a neatly trimmed moustache. The pilot locked eyes momentarily with Marcus, then looked away. Marcus thought it odd, but chalked it up to just another casual glance. Still, something about the pilot's demeanor set Marcus on edge. He reminded himself that the flight crew always had a lot on their plate. The pilot's name tag read Captain Roger Marshall. The name was vaguely familiar, but Marcus couldn't place it. Maybe he'd read about him in some airline magazine. Marcus stepped into the jet bridge, the compressed air blasting from vents above, carrying with it the distant aroma of airplane coffee and the subtle tang of cabin disinfectant. Another flight attendant, a young man with short, curly hair, greeted him warmly. "Welcome aboard, sir," the attendant said, scanning Marcus's boarding pass. "Straight down the aisle, seat 12A. Marcus nodded. "Thank you." Looking forward to a smooth flight. Taking a step inside, Marcus glanced left into the cockpit. Captain Marshall was there, fiddling with overhead switches. He cast a quick, curt look in Marcus's direction, then returned to his instruments. As Marcus walked down the aisle, the plane was abuzz with passengers juggling carry-on luggage, exchanging polite or sometimes exasperated smiles as they navigated the cramped space. He found row 12, stowed his bag, and slipped into the aisle seat. He greeted the person next to him, a teenage girl in the middle seat who appeared to be traveling alone, headphones jammed over her ears. She returned a shy half-smile. On the window seat was an older woman lost in a crossword puzzle. Marcus fastened his seatbelt and placed his phone in airplane mode, sinking back into the seat. The plane gradually filled, overhead bins clicking shut one by one. He noticed a few empty seats remained, likely in the back, or perhaps the flight wouldn't be fully booked. The flight attendants conducted their usual safety briefing, encouraging everyone to pay attention even if they'd heard it a million times. Marcus had always made a point to watch carefully, out of respect for the crew and for the small but significant possibility that he might glean something new. The plane's door closed with a low thud, followed by the hiss of the pressurizing cabin. Marcus leaned back and exhaled, expecting the pilot to come on the intercom any moment to greet them and announce the flight plan. Instead, an unexpected figure approached him. A flight attendant with a worried expression looked down at Marcus. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter," she asked quietly, double-checking a clipboard. Marcus tilted his head, surprised that they had singled him out by name. "Yes?" She bent down, lowering her voice. "Could you please follow me to the front of the plane? The captain wants to speak with you." "The captain?" Marcus repeated, instantly unsettled. "Is something wrong?" The flight attendant appeared uneasy. "He just asked to see you before we depart." "I'm not sure what it's about." A ripple of unease spread through the row. The teenage girl looked up from her headphones, curiosity evident in her eyes, while the older woman paused mid-crossword puzzle. Marcus swallowed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stood aware of curious glances from nearby passengers. Making his way up the narrow aisle felt surreal. In all the times he'd flown, he had never been summoned by the pilot. That sense of calm he had felt earlier began to erode. Waiting at the front of the plane, just outside the cockpit, was Captain Roger Marshall. He stood with his arms crossed, a hard line of disapproval etched into his face. Marcus approached cautiously, noticing the flight attendant from earlier shift uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Marcus asked, forcing his voice to remain calm and respectful. The captain's gaze was icy. "I need to ask you to switch seats," he said bluntly. "We've got a situation regarding passenger safety and distribution. You'll need to move to a seat in the back." Marcus blinked. "Passenger safety and distribution," he repeated, confusion coloring his tone. He had heard of weight distribution issues on smaller planes, but a major flight from JFK to LAX on a Boeing 737 had plenty of open seats. It seemed strange that the pilot himself would handle this so directly and single out Marcus. Captain Marshall nodded curtly. Yes, that's right. The seat you're in is, let's just say it's compromised at the moment. We need you to relocate. Now, the unwavering directness felt off. Marcus couldn't see any logical reason for the move. Can I at least ask why specifically me and not another passenger? A flash of irritation crossed Captain Marshall's face. I'm not in the habit of explaining my decisions to passengers. Are you refusing? A wave of shock washed over Marcus. No, I'm not refusing. I'm just trying to understand. The captain's jaw clenched. Look, I don't have time for a debate. Move to the back of the plane. That's an order. Something about the captain's tone, the immediate jump to authority, the lack of any plausible reason, made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck stand up. It felt personal, but he had no evidence, only an unsettling gut feeling. A swirl of thoughts clashed in Marcus's mind. He was a passenger who had paid for his seat. He had a right to question this abrupt directive. More importantly, he sensed a looming injustice, though he couldn't pinpoint its source just yet. Captain, I'm more than willing to comply with any legitimate safety issue, Marcus said, keeping his voice firm but respectful. However, I'd like to speak with someone from the cabin crew or maybe the gate agent to confirm there is, indeed, a safety concern. The flight attendant flinched, as though she knew this was heading in a dangerous direction. Captain Marshall's expression darkened. You think I'm lying? Marcus held up his hands. I didn't say that. I just need clarification. If there's a real safety reason, why aren't more passengers being moved? The pilot's gaze flicked down the aisle. A few curious heads had poked up over seats, the hush around them thickening as people sensed tension. I'm going to give you one last chance, Captain Marshall said, almost in a growl. Either you move to the back seat where I told you to, or I'll have you removed from this flight. Marcus felt the wall of authority pressing in on him, but something in him simply refused to yield. He had done nothing wrong. This was discrimination, or it certainly felt like it. Before he could respond, the pilot raised his hand, signaling for the flight attendant to intervene. At that moment, a voice broke through the tense silence. Excuse me, may I ask what's going on here? Marcus turned to see a middle-aged white man in a business suit standing a few rows behind them. His hair was graying at the temples, and he carried himself with quiet confidence. A gold corporate ID badge for a major consulting firm swung from his neck. I'm a passenger, just like the gentleman here, he said, motioning to Marcus. I can't help but overhear. Is this a legitimate safety issue or something else? The pilot bristled, turning his glare toward the newcomer. This is none of your concern, sir. Please return to your seat. The man didn't budge. If there's a safety issue that only targets one person in seat 12A, that concerns all of us, doesn't it? Captain Marshall's mouth tightened into a thin line. I'm not going to repeat myself, he warned. Return to your seat, or you'll be removed as well. Marcus saw the flash of alarm on the business passenger's face. It was the look of someone who had not expected that level of hostility. Despite the risk, the man placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder. You don't have to move if you haven't done anything wrong, he said softly. This is America. We still have rights here. As more passengers picked up on the heated exchange, murmurs rippled throughout the cabin. The teenage girl who had been seated next to Marcus leaned into the aisle, a worried expression on her face. Another passenger across the aisle craned his neck to see what was happening. Captain Marshall's face now radiated open anger. I'm not going to have a mutiny in my cabin. It's a simple request. Mr. Carter, I've told you what to do. Move. Heart pounding, Marcus tried to keep his composure. Captain, with all due respect, I believe I'm being singled out without cause. I respectfully refuse to move unless you can give me a valid safety reason or instructions from the airline. If it's about weight distribution, why am I the only passenger being asked to move? The silence was charged. The flight attendant looked from the pilot to Marcus and back again, unsure how to de-escalate the situation. Finally, she mustered her training and addressed Captain Marshall. Perhaps we can speak with ground control or the gate agent to verify any seating issue. Captain Marshall turned on her. Are you questioning my authority? The flight attendant's voice trembled slightly. No, sir. I'm just trying to help calm the situation. With that, the pilot let out a frustrated breath. Fine, let's do that. He looked at Marcus. You can return to your seat for now, but if this disrupts our takeoff schedule, we'll see how the airline handles it. Marcus nodded and turned around, his legs feeling slightly shaky from the confrontation. The man who had spoken up for him gave a discreet thumbs up before returning to his own row. Marcus walked back down the aisle, aware that nearly every eye was on him. As he sat back down, the older woman by the window asked quietly, "Are you all right, dear?" Marcus forced a smile. "Yes, I'll be fine." But inside he was anything but fine. Anxiety and anger churned in him. He didn't want to cause a scene. He wanted to get to Los Angeles on time. But dignity mattered. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being told to move to the backwards that echoed a much darker era of travel in this country. Around him, whispers flew back and forth. Passengers were speculating on what was happening. Some were annoyed at the delay, others curious about the pilot's motives. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to center himself. He could sense the pilot at the front, probably on the phone with ground control or gate agents. What would happen next? Moments later, the man who had come to Marcus's defense approached his row. He knelt beside Marcus's seat, ignoring the flight attendant's attempts to keep the aisle clear. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly. "I'm Kenneth Hall. I work for a consulting firm in Midtown." Marcus offered a grateful nod. "Thanks for speaking up, Kenneth. I'm Marcus Carter." Kenneth gave him a warm smile. "Look, if the pilot tries to push this further, I'll speak with the flight attendants or even the airline's corporate office. You're not alone in this." Marcus appreciated the solidarity, a small measure of comfort in an otherwise tense situation. "Thank you," Marcus said, genuinely moved. "I hope it doesn't come to that." Kenneth glanced at his watch. "We're already behind schedule. Let's see if we can all just get to LA in one piece. Good luck, Marcus." With that, Kenneth returned to his seat a few rows ahead. Marcus exhaled slowly, steeling himself for whatever was about to happen. The intercom crackled as Captain Marshall's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a brief delay. There is a seating issue that must be resolved before we can depart. I appreciate your patience as we comply with all Federal Aviation Administration regulations. We aim to take off as soon as possible." FAA regulations, Marcus thought grimly. He knew something about FAA protocols. He had a cousin who worked for an airline. There was no reason weight distribution would single out a lone passenger in row 12 on a relatively standard flight to LA. If anything, the pilot would have asked multiple passengers to redistribute if that were truly the issue. The pilot's announcement did nothing to quell the growing agitation in the cabin. People who had connecting flights or urgent business in LA were restless. The flight attendants looked stressed, scurrying up and down the aisle, offering passengers water as a placating gesture. 10 more minutes ticked by, feeling like an eternity. Finally, one of the gate agents came aboard, conferring quietly with a flight attendant at the front. The agent glanced down the aisle, apparently looking for Marcus. Marcus's heart thundered in his chest. Was he going to be forced off the plane now? Should he comply or stand his ground? He could see a few other passengers leaning out, trying to catch snippets of the conversation at the front of the plane. The gate agent approached row 12, with the pilot trailing a few steps behind. The agent was a middle-aged woman with a professional, but slightly harried expression. She smiled politely at Marcus, though he could see the tension beneath her veneer. "Mr. Carter," she began. My name is Amelia Houston, and I'm a gate supervisor here at JFK. The captain has informed me that there is a safety concern with your current seat. He's requesting you move to a different seat in the back of the plane. Marcus noticed how carefully she chose her words. The captain has informed me. She was putting the responsibility squarely on him. Marcus nodded calmly. I've asked for clarification on why specifically my seat is a problem. Is this truly about safety, or is there another reason? Amelia's gaze flicked to Captain Marshall, then back to Marcus. Well, we do have some open seats in the rear. Typically, the captain does have final authority regarding seating arrangements if there's a concern. I'm just here to help facilitate. Marcus took a deep breath. I understand the captain has authority, but I also have a right to question if this is based on actual safety protocols. I've asked if there's a legitimate reason, and none has been provided. I'm sorry, but I can't comply with something that feels baseless and discriminatory. Captain Marshall stepped closer, his voice low and sharp. I'll have you removed from this aircraft for failing to comply with the pilot's instructions. On what grounds? Marcus challenged. On grounds of insubordination and interfering with the operation of this flight. The air around them crackled with tension. Amelia cast a wary glance at the pilot, clearly aware that the situation was escalating beyond normal protocol. Before Marcus could respond, another passenger rose from her seat, an elderly black woman, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, perhaps in her 70s. She moved down the aisle with a measured grace and approached Amelia and Captain Marshall. I couldn't help overhearing, the woman began, her voice clear and resolute. My name is Harriet Robinson, and I'm a retired attorney. I'd like to know if the passenger is in violation of any specific FAA rule. Captain Marshall turned, clearly irritated by the interruption. Ma'am, this is between me and the passenger. Harriet, undeterred, reached inside her purse and pulled out a small notebook. I'm well versed in airline regulations and the Federal Aviation Act. If there's an explicit safety regulation that requires him to move, please state it. Otherwise, asking him to relinquish his seat, particularly under these circumstances, raises concerns. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward this woman. Passengers around them were riveted, some even quietly applauding Harriet's courage. Amelia, the gate supervisor, seemed conflicted. Ma'am, we're just trying to resolve the matter quickly. Perhaps we can speak privately. Harriet gave a polite but firm nod. Certainly. But I will accompany you, Mr. Carter, if you don't mind, to ensure nothing is being misrepresented. Captain Marshall looked like he was about to combust. His glare at Harriet could have melted steel. But Harriet stood her ground, seemingly unafraid of the intimidation tactic. Under Harriet's insistence, a small group of people, Marcus, Harriet, Amelia, and one flight attendant, stepped off the aircraft into the jet bridge to discuss the matter without holding up the other passengers. The pilot trailed them, maintaining a stony silence. The moment they were in the jet bridge, Harriet turned to Amelia. I'd like to know on what grounds the captain is claiming a safety issue. If it's about weight distribution, the passenger manifest would indicate if multiple passengers need to be moved. If it's about mechanical issues, we'd have an entirely different protocol. Amelia cleared her throat. Well, the captain has indicated that seat 12A is causing some kind of imbalance, Harriet cut in, which on a Boeing 737 is extremely unlikely to be an isolated seat issue, especially if the flight is not completely full. Furthermore, the pilot's manual for seat-related weight distribution typically addresses multiple seats or cargo adjustments. Amelia looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, you're correct in that the pilot usually addresses multiple seats. However, the captain has final authority at this point. Captain Marshall interjected, his tone icy. The final authority is not up for debate. If I say there's a safety issue, that's what it is. Harriet's eyes hardened. "You do have final authority for flight safety, Captain Marshall, but you're still bound by federal anti-discrimination laws and the guidelines set by the Federal Aviation Administration." Marcus looked from Harriet to the pilot, tension coiling in his stomach. He could practically see the internal struggle playing out in the gate supervisor's mind. She was torn between backing her pilot and adhering to corporate and legal standards. Captain Marshall turned to Amelia. "If this passenger will not comply with my safety directive, then I want him off my plane." Amelia hesitated. "Captain, if we remove a passenger, we need a clear justification. This could escalate into a major issue for the airline." "Then let it escalate," the pilot snapped. "I'm not flying until he's off or moves to the back." Marcus felt a surge of helpless anger. But Harriet gently placed a hand on his arm. "Mr. Carter, perhaps now is the time to document what's happening. These are serious allegations." Marcus nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out his phone. He started recording the conversation, making sure to capture Captain Marshall's face and voice. "What do you think you're doing?" Captain Marshall demanded. "Documenting," Harriet said calmly. "In case we need this for a formal complaint." Amelia looked around nervously, lowering her voice. "Captain, please, maybe we should consult with airline management before removing Mr. Carter. Our flight is already delayed. The passenger has done nothing to compromise safety." Captain Marshall's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. He seemed to realize he was cornered by legalities he couldn't bulldoze. In the sudden silence, Harriet took the opportunity to speak again. "If you do remove Mr. Carter, I will advise him to file a discrimination lawsuit, and I will personally contact the FAA to investigate whether this flight is operating in compliance with regulations." Marcus felt a glimmer of resolve. Harriet's mention of the FAA was an idea he had entertained ever since the pilot invoked FAA regulations earlier. He steadied himself. "Actually," Marcus said, voice shaking but determined, "let's do that right now. I'm calling the FAA's hotline for passenger discrimination." He opened his phone's browser, quickly searching for the Federal Aviation Administration's consumer hotline number. If the pilot was going to misuse his authority, Marcus intended to fight back with legitimate channels. Captain Marshall's eyes widened, and he looked around, suddenly acutely aware of the ramifications. Harriet nodded approvingly at Marcus. Amelia tried to mediate. "Now, let's not escalate." "I'm not escalating," Marcus replied. "I'm following protocol for an official complaint about possible discriminatory practices by a commercial pilot." It was at that moment that the flight attendant, who had been quiet all this time, finally spoke up. "Mr. Carter is correct. There's a hotline, and no passenger should be forced to move without a valid safety reason. I've seen nothing that indicates a real safety concern." Captain Marshall glared at the attendant, fury dancing in his eyes, but he remained silent, as though fully realizing the potential legal nightmare he was wading into. While Marcus waited on the line for the FAA's Consumer Complaint Division, Amelia took a step back and spoke into her walkie-talkie, presumably contacting her superiors. Harriet kept a vigilant watch, her posture exuding a calm confidence that dared anyone to contradict the law in her presence. After a few tense seconds, Amelia turned to the group, her expression tense but composed. "I've spoken with the airline's station manager. They recommend that Mr. Carter remain on board in his assigned seat, unless the captain can produce a legitimate safety directive in writing. If not, we should continue with normal operations." Marcus could almost see a vein throbbing in Captain Marshall's temple. The gate supervisor was overriding him, something that must not have happened often in his career. Harriet raised an eyebrow, waiting for the pilot's response. For a moment, the pilot looked like he might physically lash out. Then he took a step back, exhaling sharply. "Fine," he said curtly. "But if anything goes wrong during this flight, I'm holding you and your superiors personally responsible." Harriet gave a tight smile. "Understood." but I'm fairly confident there'll be no issues unless there's something else going on. Marcus ended his call with the FAA line after leaving a detailed voice message describing the situation. He saved the reference number he was given. Harriet patted his shoulder reassuringly. "Thank you," he whispered, overwhelmed by the swirl of events. She nodded. "Let's board, shall we?" The walk back down the jet bridge felt like a victory parade and a funeral march all at once. Marcus could feel triumph in the sense that he had stood his ground, but also dread, wondering how the pilot's simmering anger might manifest during the flight. The moment they re-entered the cabin, dozens of eyes flicked toward them. Harriet took her seat in first class, meeting Marcus's gaze with a small nod of encouragement. Marcus made his way to row 12 again, feeling an odd mixture of pride and anxiety. The seat was still his. The older woman by the window gave him a reassuring pat on the arm, and the teenage girl looked visibly relieved that he had returned. A few passengers offered discreet thumbs up or small applause. Kenneth, the man who had spoken up earlier, caught his eye from across the aisle and mouthed, "Glad you're back." Meanwhile, Captain Marshall returned to the cockpit. Soon the overhead announcement chimed again. His voice, now taut and clipped, announced, "Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff." Harriet, still poised despite the turbulence of events, walks back to check on Marcus. She reassures him that his stand for justice is valid and offers her legal insight if matters escalate further. Though Marcus is grateful, he remains tense, aware that the flight is far from over. Kenneth, the businessman who spoke up earlier, stops by as well, expressing support and promising to intervene again if needed. These brief interactions give Marcus hope and remind him that he is not alone. Passengers nearby sense the strain in the air, but a few words of kindness and unity buoy everyone's spirits. As the flight continues, Marcus notices his overhead reading light malfunctioning, flickering out without explanation. Though it might be a simple technical glitch, he can't help wondering if Captain Marshall has some hand in this minor inconvenience, an unsettling reminder that the pilot's hostility may linger. He calls a flight attendant, who apologizes but admits the light can only be repaired on the ground. Even as Marcus tries to focus on work, the thought of unseen sabotage troubles him. Nonetheless, the solidarity he's felt from Harriet, Kenneth, and other supportive passengers helps him stay resolute, determined to see this ordeal through. As the flight progressed, Marcus tried to distract himself with work, reviewing his upcoming presentation slides on his laptop. The teenage girl next to him listened to music, occasionally stealing glances at him as if to confirm everything was still okay. Then something odd happened. His overhead reading light flickered and then went off. He checked the switch, toggling it, but it wouldn't come back on. He flagged a flight attendant. This one was different from before, a young woman with a gentle smile. He explained the problem with the reading light. She tried a few switches but couldn't fix it. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," she said, frowning. "We might need maintenance on the ground to fix that." He managed a polite smile. "No worries. It's not that big of a deal." However, he couldn't shake a nagging suspicion. It was probably just a coincidence, a minor equipment malfunction, but after everything that had happened, he was inclined to question if the pilot was orchestrating anything else, like turning off his reading light from the cockpit. It seemed petty and unprofessional, but so did forcing a passenger to move seats for no valid reason. Another hour passed. Passengers settled into various activities, some watching in-flight movies, others snoozing under airline blankets, a few rummaging through the overhead compartments for snacks or laptops. Marcus's phone, in airplane mode, displayed the list of messages he would send the moment they landed in LA. He had typed up a summary of the incident, ready to email to his boss and to the airline's customer service department, as well as an official complaint he'd half-composed for the FAA. Kenneth, the man who had also voiced support, came by as he stretched his legs. He leaned over Marcus's seat, How's everything going? Not too bad, Marcus said softly, careful not to draw too much attention. Kenneth nodded. I was ready to walk off the plane if they kicked you off. That was insane. Marcus smiled appreciatively. I can't thank you enough, but hopefully it won't come to that. Kenneth patted Marcus's shoulder and wandered back to his seat. The simple interactions felt like a small but meaningful bond, forged under tense circumstances. 3 hours into the flight, they hit turbulence. Nothing terrifying at first, just a few bumps that caused the seatbelt sign to ding on. Marcus instinctively looked out the window. Though the older woman in the window seat had pulled down the shade to nap, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, stiff as usual. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected weather patterns. Please remain in your seats with seat belts fastened. Flight attendants, take your seats as well. Marcus watched as the flight attendants hurried to stow away their carts and secure themselves in jump seats. The plane rattled, causing a collective gasp among passengers. Then came a jolt, harder than the previous ones, that caused a drink or two to spill. Marcus's heart thudded. As someone who was normally calm during flights, he found himself uncharacteristically anxious. Was the turbulence truly that severe, or was something else going on? Another sharp bump rattled the cabin, and the older woman beside him stirred awake, blinking in confusion. Across the aisle, a mother tried to soothe her crying baby. The pilot made no further announcements, leaving the cabin in an uncomfortable silence, punctuated by occasional rattles. Finally, the turbulence subsided. Marcus exhaled, along with half the passengers who had been holding their breath. The seatbelt sign remained on, but a sense of calm began to restore itself. Harriet came down the aisle shortly after, still poised despite the turbulent patch. She bent close to Marcus. Are you all right? He nodded, though his nerves were still vibrating from the jostling. Yeah, I hope that was just normal turbulence. Harriet gave him a pointed look. Under normal circumstances, I'd say yes. But after everything, I can't help wondering. Marcus sighed. I know, but I can't imagine a pilot would endanger everyone just because of a vendetta against me. Harriet's eyes flicked around as she lowered her voice. That would be unthinkable, but keep your eyes open. I don't trust him. Before Marcus could respond, a flight attendant gently reminded Harriet to return to her seat, as the seatbelt sign was still on. Harriet complied, giving Marcus one last, resolute nod. The hours dragged on, each minute fraught with the possibility of another confrontation. Marcus tried to distract himself with a movie on the seatback screen. He forced himself to focus on comedic scenes, hoping to lighten his mood. Meanwhile, the flight attendants passed out sandwiches and drinks. Marcus accepted the turkey sandwich, but found he had little appetite. As he forced down a few bites, his thoughts drifted to the presentation he would deliver in LA. The day had begun with so much promise, yet this ordeal had overshadowed everything. Eventually, the pilot made another terse announcement. We are on course for an on-time arrival, despite our delay at JFK. Estimated time of arrival is 2:40 p.m. local. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. On time, Marcus thought with relief. At least he wouldn't miss his business meeting or connections on the ground. He glanced at his phone again, mentally preparing for the flurry of calls he'd make once the plane touched down. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, a normal procedure to allow passengers to adjust to the exterior light. Marcus felt his stomach flutter with mild altitude changes, but he was grateful they were nearing journey's end. Just then, the intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, the pilot's voice said, we have a minor mechanical issue that requires us to circle once around Los Angeles International Airport. We'll be in a holding pattern for approximately 20 minutes. A groan of frustration rippled through the cabin, though mechanical holds weren't entirely uncommon. Marcus chewed his lip, anxious to get off the plane. He peered around, noticing Harriet frowning. Kenneth looked at Marcus with a shrug, as if to say, "What can we do?" The plane circled over LA, occasionally dipping through patches of cloud. Every second felt like a lifetime. The flight attendants prepared the cabin for landing, ensuring seat backs were upright, tray tables stowed, and seat belts securely fastened. Suddenly, the plane jerked slightly, a brief but disconcerting dip that caused a few gasps. Then Captain Marshall's voice returned. "Apologies, folks. We're correcting our approach now. Cabin crew, please be seated for landing." Marcus's heart pounded. He clutched the armrest, eyes locked on the seat in front of him. He tried to quell the irrational fear that the pilot might be taking out his anger in subtle ways. Finally, they made their final approach. The plane's wings leveled. The runway loomed closer, and with a bump and a screech of wheels, Flight 2138 touched down at LAX. A heavy sigh of relief seemed to pass through the cabin like a wave. The pilot taxied the plane to the gate, and soon the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers stood to retrieve their belongings. The tension that had plagued the flight was replaced by the typical impatience to disembark. Marcus was in no rush. He waited until the aisle cleared a bit. As he stood, Harriet was waiting just ahead, gesturing for him to follow her. Kenneth also lingered, evidently wanting to see how things played out. "You're not alone," Harriet said quietly. "We'll make sure everything's documented properly." Marcus nodded, heart pounding with both relief and residual anger. They slowly inched toward the plane's exit, where Captain Marshall was standing outside the cockpit door, arms folded. Captain Marshall watched passengers file out, hardly acknowledging their presence. When Marcus approached, Harriet at his side, the pilot's eyes locked onto him. "Mr. Carter," the pilot said flatly, "I trust you had a pleasant flight." The sarcasm was evident. Harriet lifted her chin. "Captain Marshall, consider yourself on notice. We'll be filing a formal complaint." The pilot's only response was a thin, humorless smile. "I look forward to it." Kenneth stepped forward, addressing the pilot. "Sir, what you did was unacceptable. I'll be reporting this as well." For a split second, the pilot looked like he might lash out verbally, but he held his tongue. Harriet gently tugged on Marcus's arm, signaling they should move on. Marcus made brief eye contact with the pilot, a silent acknowledgement that this wasn't over. Then he stepped off the plane. Stepping into the bustling concourse of Los Angeles International Airport was like emerging from a pressure chamber. Marcus took a deep breath of the conditioned terminal air, feeling a rush of freedom. Harriet, Kenneth, and even a couple of other supportive passengers congregated near the arrival gate. "Listen," Harriet said, "I have contacts in the legal field. Let me know if you want to pursue legal action. I believe you have grounds for a discrimination case, or at least a thorough internal investigation by the FAA." Marcus nodded. "Thank you. I'll definitely consider it. First, I need to contact the airline's customer service, and then I have my own business commitments." Kenneth added, "I have a friend who's a journalist at the Los Angeles Times. If you want to get your story out there, I can connect you." While they stood there, an airline representative, someone different from the gate agent, approached them, looking hurried and apologetic. "Mr. Carter, I'm Samantha from Customer Relations. We received a report from JFK about a possible discrimination issue on Flight 2138. I'd like to get your statement if possible." Marcus glanced at Harriet, who nodded. "Sure, let's find a private space." Samantha led them to a nearby lounge area. Over the next 20 minutes, Harriet and Marcus recounted the entire ordeal, how the pilot demanded Marcus switch seats without providing a valid reason, the confrontation, the involvement of the gate supervisor at JFK, and the pilot's hostility throughout the flight. Samantha took diligent notes. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We take these accusations very seriously. The airline's internal affairs team will launch an immediate investigation, and Captain Marshall may be placed on temporary leave while this is underway." Harriet's eyebrows rose. "Temporary leave?" Samantha nodded, her face grave. "Yes, pending the results of our investigation. In the meantime, Mr. Carter, we'd like to offer you compensation for the distress and any inconvenience caused." She handed Marcus a card with a direct phone line to an airline liaison, as well as a voucher for future flights and a promise of potential reimbursement for his ticket. Marcus took it with mixed emotions. While compensation was welcome, it didn't change the humiliation and stress he had experienced. Harriet offered Samantha a business card of her own. "Please add me to any communications. I'll represent Mr. Carter's interests to ensure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Samantha nodded, then extended a polite handshake to them both. "Rest assured, we'll be in touch very soon." Despite the turmoil, Marcus had no choice but to press on with the reason for his trip. He headed to his hotel, showered off the stress, and reviewed his presentation notes. The memory of the flight hung over him, but he forced himself to focus on the opportunity at hand. The meeting the next day went exceptionally well. Marcus delivered his pitch with poise and intelligence that impressed both his clients and his own company's representatives. When they asked if anything was wrong, noticing the dark circles under his eyes, Marcus merely said he'd had a challenging flight. That evening, back in his hotel room, he finally checked his email. Among the congratulatory messages from colleagues on his presentation was an official email from the airline. They wanted a detailed, written statement, which he provided. Attached were some scanned pages of Harriet's notes, which she had sent to him for reference. 2 days later, a call came from a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Marcus picked up, and a polite voice introduced themselves as an investigator from the Federal Aviation Administration. "Mr. Carter, we've received your complaint, along with several passenger statements and a notification from the airline regarding the pilot's behavior. We'd like to verify a few details and possibly schedule an interview." Marcus's heart pounded. "Of course, I'm happy to help." Over the next hour, he spoke to the investigator, providing a step-by-step account of what happened. He explained the pilot's demand, Harriet's legal intervention, the gate supervisor's remarks, and the subsequent events during the flight. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," the investigator said at the end. "We are coordinating with the airline's own investigation. If the allegations hold up, Captain Marshall could face serious repercussions." "Serious repercussions?" Marcus echoed. The investigator's voice was calm but firm. "Yes, possibly suspension of his pilot's license pending further review or revocation if we find he has a history of discriminatory incidents. We have zero tolerance for that under our regulations." Marcus thanked the investigator, feeling both validated and anxious. The memory of Captain Marshall's glare still lingered in his mind. A week later, Harriet called Marcus with news. "I spoke to a contact in the airline's corporate office," she said. "Apparently, Captain Marshall has been reported before for inappropriate conduct toward passengers, but never anything this blatant. He may have used the weight distribution excuse before, targeting passengers he didn't like." Marcus listened in shock. "So there's a pattern." "Yes, but no one ever pushed it this far." Some of the complaints never reached an official level. This time, however, the airline and the FAA are taking it seriously because your case is well documented and we have multiple witnesses. Marcus thought back to the man in the business suit, the teenage girl, Harriet, and the flight attendant's quiet corroboration. They all played a role in ensuring this wouldn't be brushed aside. A few days after that call, Marcus received an email from Samantha at the airline. She informed him that Captain Marshall was suspended without pay, pending the outcome of a final hearing with the FAA. She also apologized again on behalf of the airline and reiterated their compensation offers. Harriet called him shortly after. "It looks like the airline is cleaning house. They can't afford the bad press. Word has gotten out on social media too." Indeed, Marcus had noticed that Kenneth had posted about the incident on his LinkedIn, garnering thousands of reactions and hundreds of comments condemning discrimination in the airline industry. Harriet had done interviews with a couple of local media outlets, highlighting the legal and moral issues at hand. It all culminated in a formal hearing where the FAA reviewed Captain Marshall's actions. Multiple witnesses testified, including Harriet, the flight attendant, and even the gate supervisor from JFK. In the end, the FAA revoked Captain Marshall's commercial pilot license for violating federal regulations and passenger rights. The airline, in turn, fired him. Though the outcome was a victory for justice, Marcus found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. He felt relief that the pilot's discriminatory actions had been addressed and that his voice had mattered. Yet the experience left him more guarded, more aware of how easily prejudice could surface in unexpected places. He found some solace in Harriet's mentorship and occasional meetups. She insisted they stay in touch, and they formed a bond over the incident that had once been an unlikely catalyst for a newfound friendship. Kenneth, too, stayed in contact, occasionally sending messages of encouragement and updates on his own corporate world. "I told the story to my boss," Kenneth wrote. "We're implementing better diversity training at our firm, inspired by what happened to you." Marcus's own company recognized his resilience, praising him not only for the successful pitch in Los Angeles, but also for handling the flight incident with dignity and composure. The pilot, once renowned for his air hours and experience, now stood disgraced, his career in tatters. News of his dismissal circulated among aviation circles, effectively blacklisting him from reputable airlines. Meanwhile, Marcus rose in his field. His calm under pressure had impressed executives, and the Los Angeles deal soared forward, bringing him a promotion and substantial pay raise. Friends, family, and even casual acquaintances, upon hearing the story, expressed admiration for his courage. Harriet's old law firm invited her to speak on a panel about travel discrimination, and she invited Marcus to join as a guest speaker. Together, they spoke about the importance of standing up against injustice, even in places as mundane as seat assignments on an airplane. In a twist of fate, the ironically labeled weight distribution issue had redistributed more than just passenger seats. It had redistributed power, shining a spotlight on injustice and propelling the good, honest people into positions of greater influence and respect. Months later, Marcus boarded another flight from JFK to LAX, this time for a new business venture. He felt a flicker of apprehension walking down the jet bridge, remembering the confrontation that had changed his life. But as he settled into his seat, he exhaled, reassuring himself that not every flight would be marred by discrimination. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. Can I get you anything to make your flight more comfortable?" Marcus shook his head, smiling back. "No, I'm good, thank you." The attendant moved on, and Marcus leaned his head against the seatback, reflecting on how that single flight months ago had triggered events that reshaped his understanding of fairness and courage. He was still the same person, but his sense of self-advocacy had grown sharper. The plane took off without a hitch, and as they climbed above the clouds, Marcus allowed himself a quiet moment of gratitude. The sky no longer felt foreboding or tinged with old dread. Instead, it represented possibility, a horizon wide open for those brave enough to confront injustice wherever it appeared. Sometime later, Marcus heard a rumor that Captain Marshall had appealed the FAA's decision and was trying to regain his license through legal channels. Harriet assured Marcus that the evidence against Marshall was comprehensive. It was unlikely any court would reverse the decision, given the number of witnesses and the pilot's documented history of questionable behavior. Still, Marcus felt a pang of sympathy. Even for someone who had wronged him, losing a career was no small matter. But Harriet had reminded him, actions have consequences. If you repeatedly violate others' rights, eventually karma knocks you off your pedestal. And so it was. The pilot who tried to shame Marcus ended up facing a fate far harsher than losing a seat assignment. He lost the seat in the cockpit itself. Word of the incident eventually filtered through the corporate world. Marcus's LinkedIn connections soared, and people reached out to him with stories of similar experiences, offering solidarity. Some wanted to know how he found the courage to stand up. Others shared their own heartbreaks of being discriminated against by authority figures. Encouraged by Harriet and Kenneth, Marcus wrote an op-ed in a major online publication discussing the importance of everyday courage and collective action. He cited Harriet's legal intervention, Kenneth's willingness to risk confrontation, and the flight attendant who corroborated his account as prime examples of how ordinary people can challenge injustice when they unite. The op-ed garnered attention, prompting discussions in social media circles and even within the airline industry about ongoing improvements to address implicit bias in flight crews. Over time, the drama settled, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had happened on Flight 2138. In the grand scheme of things, it was a single flight among thousands every day, but it carried a powerful lesson. Marcus often thought back to the moment he nearly relinquished his seat. If not for Harriet's intervention, Kenneth's support, and his own conviction, he might have ended up in the back of the plane, humiliated and powerless. Instead, they confronted the injustice head-on, and the reverberations of that single stand echoed far beyond the cabin walls. In the end, justice had been served. And for Marcus Carter, the flight that began with a pilot's demand ended as a story of collective bravery, unwavering dignity, and the promise that, when enough voices speak truth to power, even the highest barriers can come crashing down. This story isn't just about a single flight from New York to Los Angeles. It's a powerful reminder that standing your ground can transform an unjust moment into a catalyst for accountability. Every time someone steps forward to confront discrimination, whether it's in a cramped airplane cabin or a corporate boardroom, change ripples outward. One person's courage can inspire another's, creating a chain reaction of solidarity and truth. If you believe this story can uplift someone in need of hope or embolden others to speak out against injustice, consider sharing it. Let's amplify the message that no one has the right to undermine another's dignity. By liking, commenting, and subscribing, you help spread real stories that encourage us all to stand strong when faced with unfairness. Your support ensures more voices are heard and that justice always has a fighting chance to prevail.